Joe Parkinson. I'm Director of the Goody Bioethics Centre in Perth, and this is the 5th module in the online ethics course, Decoding the Code. What we're going to do today is, first of all, focus on the human person and ethics as a way of engaging people and respecting people. There is a pre-reading case study for this module, the Baby James case study, and I'm assuming that everyone has read that case study before we begin. I'm going to work from a values-based framework, which was one framework for applying ethical standards to clinical situations. And we're going to look at chapters 1, 2 and 3 of the Code of Ethical Standards for Catholic Health and Aged Care Providers in Australia. There's also a webcast that accompanies this module. So we begin with a focus on the human person and the dignity of the human person and the fact that we're called to wholeness. Jesus comes that we can have life to the full, St. John's Gospel tells us. And every ministry of the church, whether it's healthcare, aged care, education, social service or whatever, aims at bringing people to the fullness of life. Whether a person is sick and needs healing, whether they're aged and need additional care, whether they are young and need education, whether they're marginalised and need to be re-included in society, all of us need to be brought to the fullness of life, and we need help to do that. So Catholic ministries exist to continue the healing mission of Jesus by bringing the fullness of life, and we do that when we pay attention to the whole person. The American paediatrician Margaret Moorman, in her book Medicine as Ministry, picks up the metaphor of writing a story. And she says, often people in hospital have written their story quite successfully up to the point of illness. They then have a new factor, the illness, to weave into their story, and they often need help to do that. So our task as caregivers is not to deliver a pre-packaged answer, but to work with the person to enable them to make sense of this new factor in their life so that they can write the next chapter successfully, make sense of their life as they go on. I think that's a great metaphor because it tells us that we, while we are caregivers, we are carers, we don't have all of the answers. In a sense, it's the person who needs care who always sets the agenda. In the medical relationship, the doctor can come across as the one in control, the one who holds all of the information. But really, what the doctor can contribute is determined by what the patient needs. So the patient retains control. And we need to be people who can identify that and optimise that and return control to this person so that they leave our care with the fullest life they can have, even if that includes an ongoing illness. Ethics is how do we do that? How do we make sure that we are true to our values, to the values of Jesus, to the values of the gospel, to the values of our Christian tradition, and to the person that we're caring for? So ethics is primarily about relationships, it's primarily about culture, and only in a secondary sense is it about problem solving. So when we enter the Code of Ethical Standards, particularly chapters 1, 2, 3, which deal with specific areas of need, we need to avoid the temptation to see the code as a book of answers. It provides us with touchstones, guide points for our consideration as we negotiate the terrain of this person's life for their benefit. So now let's turn to the case study, which is the study of Baby James. Now I'm assuming that everyone has read the case study, but there are some touchstones that we need to bear in mind as we move through this module. James faces a threat to his vision and therefore a threat to his quality of life. The difficulty in this particular case comes down to working out how do we find the right path for James, given that the clinical team want to follow one course of treatment and his parents want to follow another. It's complicated because there's a very narrow window of opportunity for us to act. The ethics consultation which took place, and which we'll come back to in a moment, was about negotiating that terrain so that everyone could walk away from the table feeling respected, and of course that's especially for baby James. So a way into the case study will be to apply a values-based framework for ethical decision making. Now there are many frameworks we can use, and the literature is, I've counted about 11 that are helpful, but this is one I've found very useful because it's simple to remember and it prioritises the work we have to do. So the first step is to identify the facts of the clinical case. The case of baby James is fairly straightforward in terms of we know where this illness is going. We know what will happen if action is not taken. And we have a fairly good idea of the outcomes of at least one treatment plan. The difficulty was we weren't sure what the parents' plan would lead to. The second step is to identify any values that we need to protect. Here, of course, we want to protect the life and the health and, as far as we can, the vision of baby James. But because we're people who live in relationships, it was important for us to look to the future relationship between James and his parents, the relationship between mum and dad, and then in the likelihood that James would need ongoing treatment at other times in his life, the relationship between his parents and the clinical team. The third step, are there any guiding ethical principles from our tradition that can help us cut through some of the hard work? Are there rules of thumb that we've developed that help us to work out, well, we know roughly where to go with this? The next step is, have we got the right people around the table? Who should make the decision? When we're dealing with an adult, the adult would make a decision. If it's not them in person, if they're not competent, then there will be another person, next of kin or appointed guardian, who will act on their behalf. In this case, we had James' parents who have a duty of care to James, but the hospital also has a duty of care to James. And that's where it got tricky, because we had conflicting views about what was in James' best interest. It's so important that we get the right people around the table early. In my experience, most ethical problems actually reduce to communication problems. And if we can have clarity amongst all of the key players, I've found most ethical decisions solve themselves. The last step is, can we review the decision? Now that's important for two reasons. The first is, as the treatment plan progresses, James' needs might change. So we need to be prepared to change tack if that's in his best interest. But the other reason is that every clinical case is a learning opportunity. And we need to be prepared to review each decision we've made, affirm it, or perhaps walk away thinking, I'll do it differently next time. There's always more to learn. Now, in a sense, we're going to take the case of baby James, we're going to process through this 5-step framework, and we're going to do that as a way of showing how philosophical principles and values can actually translate into clear clinical treatment plans. So let's get our work underway with chapter 1 of the code. So this is chapter 1 of the second part of the code, and it deals with decision making. The presumption is that the patient themselves is responsible for their own health care. Now, as adults, that's certainly something that we would value, and that as caregivers we would uphold. It's about empowering people to make the best decisions they can for their own health care. In the case of baby James, who can't make a decision himself, he's part of a community of care, which is first of all his family, but then also the paediatric hospital. Even as adults, we are part of a community of care. Again, it might be our families, it includes our clinicians, the caregivers in a healthcare setting, those who help us to fulfil our healthcare needs, pharmacists, physiotherapists, and so many others. It reinforces the fact that all human beings are relational in nature. So to provide optimum care, we need to pay attention not only to the patient, but also to all of the others who will be involved in helping that person regain health or retain health going forward. In order to make a good decision, a clinical care decision, I need to know what's going on. So that creates an obligation on the caregiver to tell me the truth, to be honest with me, and also to preserve confidentiality in our communication. The therapeutic relationship is one of the most sacred relationships we have because it touches on my very physical person. It refers to who I am and what I'm suffering at the moment, but also who I can be, who I want to be, and how I can get there. These are intensely personal issues, and it's absolutely necessary that there is good trust between the caregiver and the care receiver. So truth-telling, honesty, and absolute confidentiality. The best medical decision requires me to understand the information that's communicated, so it has to be communicated in a way that I'm able to understand. It requires my capacity. I have to have the capacity to make a decision, and it requires me to give express consent in some form, sometimes in a written statement, but always as an expression of my preferences. Now, we'll come back to the question of consent in Module 7 of this program. On the question of consent, there are two other issues that we need to pay attention to. One is the possibility that a patient may need someone else to make a decision for them. So the option of an alternate decision maker. Now, that's known in different states by different names, and each state has its own legislation. It's really important that we're on top of our local legislation around enduring powers of guardianship or enduring powers of medical attorney. The second point around consent is recognition that every patient has the right to refuse any treatment. Now, we have a guideline or a principle that guides our thinking about the right to refuse treatment. It goes by different names: extraordinary, ordinary means of treatment. I prefer to call it the morally disproportionate means of medical treatment. Some treatments will be proportionate, all things considered. Some will be disproportionate. So the touchstones we use to work that out, first of all, is the treatment likely to produce reasonable therapeutic benefit? That is, will it actually do me good given the totality of my pathologies? Secondly, is the treatment reasonably available? Some treatments may do me a great deal of good, but I have to travel to the other side of the world to get them. Am I obliged to do that? Thirdly, does the treatment threaten to impose an unreasonable burden upon me? Now, that's a judgment only I can make as the one receiving care. The question of therapeutic benefit, the doctor can provide information. The question of availability is a function of the local health system. But the question of burden is really my call alone. What constitutes an unreasonable burden? It could be unreasonable pain, it could be unreasonable expense, it could be a treatment which produces in me a reaction of disdain or disgust or horror. If I don't want to receive the treatment because I believe it will be unduly burdensome upon me, then I don't need to agree to receive the treatment. I can let nature take its course. And that's true even when I need that treatment to stay alive. The second chapter of the second part of the code deals with sexuality and relationships, reproductive issues. Now, this doesn't play directly into the case of baby James, and there will be other opportunities to review the material on sexuality. It's a very complex theological picture of what it means to be human. However, it's important that we have at least a basic understanding of the content of the chapter. The most important point to bear in mind is that in our Christian tradition, we never think about sexuality except in the context of committed relationships. So sexuality is an aspect of an established committed relationship. It's not a way to build a relationship, it's a way of expressing the life of that relationship. The second important point is that we understand life as a gift, and it's a gift passed on by persons to a new person. So that relates the question of sexuality to the question of reproduction. In the Catholic understanding, life begins at conception, and we talk about the need to respect the gift of life from conception until natural death. Now that time frame has become almost a mantra within Catholic circles, and it establishes the golden rule, as it were, for all health and aged care providers. We respect people from the moment of conception until the moment of natural death. One of the consequences of this rule is we believe that all human life is worthy of respect, and that includes life which is severely disabled or severely ill or drawing to its close or still just beginning. A particular difficulty in this area is the possibility of prenatal testing, prenatal screening. During pregnancy, it's possible to pick up abnormalities in the fetus, and then there are questions that have to be made around continuing the pregnancy or how this will be managed going forward. Now, there is a webcast in this series that deals specifically with that question, so I'll leave that with you. Before we move on, however, it's important that we draw some lessons together from just the material we've seen so far in Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. There are consequences for adopting a consistent ethic of life from the moment of conception to natural death. It requires a commitment from us to care for all people in all kinds of situations. It creates a difficulty for us with the preborn. It creates a difficulty for us with those who are in long, slow decline towards death. The discussion that was had some years ago around people in the post-coma unresponsive state. These also are people prior to natural death demanding, requiring our greatest attention. There are some general principles that help us work through these difficult situations. One is complex questions will have complex answers. If an ethical situation is replete with difficulty and unknown, expect your answer to be uncertain. Sometimes, even when we have as much information as we can, we find ourselves in an apparent dilemma. I can do one thing and that looks bad. I can do another and that looks worse. What should I do? Logic says I should do the least evil. And in fact, that's one of our guiding principles, the principle of the lesser evil. But it only applies where the situation resolves to a genuine dilemma. There are two other principles that are really important as we go about the process of resolving ethical issues. One is, I need to respect each person even if I don't agree with them. Patients may make decisions we don't agree with. I need to accept that. That sometimes it'll be important for me, in order to look after my own dignity, to step back from the therapeutic relationship. That's the issue of conscientious objection, which is guaranteed us in the Code. Chapter 3 of the Code deals with respect for bodily integrity, which is an expression of our belief that we are embodied spirits. Our bodies are us, and we need to look after them and nurture them as best we can. Two particularly problematic questions arise. One is the case of sexual assault. Can a woman protect herself from the unwanted effects of unwanted intercourse? Now, the Code gives us very clear guidance on that. There's a protocol in this chapter, and it's really important that people in accident and emergency especially are familiar with the protocol. The second issue is around organ and tissue transplant. Now, that's also extremely important. It doesn't bear that much on the baby James case. In the baby James case, though, we are very concerned about the integrity of James and his life going forward. So let's turn now to revisit the case study. So applying the perspectives that we've seen in chapters 1, 2 and 3 of the Code, we can see that there are a number of unresolved tensions in the case of baby James. One is the tension between the integrity of James' body, the fact that he could lose an eye, with preserving his life. So there's something to be gained, something to be lost. The second is respect for the relationships that are around James, respect for the relationship with his parents, but also respect for the clinical team who are seeking to provide care. The third brings us back to that principle of the morally proportionate means of treatment, the therapeutic benefit of the different treatments offered against the cost of surgery, the burden of surgery. So what actually happened in the baby James case? The conversation we had around the table resolved to find a middle way between James' parents and the clinical team. James' parents wanted to keep his eye to reduce the tumour so that he could keep that eye intact going forward, even if he had limited vision in it. The clinical team were very concerned at the possibility of seeding cancer back into James' brain. The Clinical Ethics Service was able to facilitate an arrangement whereby the clinical team agreed to try chemo reduction of the tumour, to give one dose of chemotherapy. If James reacted badly, or if the tumour didn't shrink sufficiently within a defined time frame, then we would go to option B, which was to take out the eye. What actually happened? James reacted very badly to the first dose of chemotherapy, so his parents immediately stood back and said, all right, plan B. James' eye was taken out the same day, and he left hospital as a very healthy baby, but with one eye. I'd like to make some concluding comments about the practice of clinical decision making in ethics. The first is one I've already mentioned. Most ethical decisions, most ethical problems in clinical work, I think resolve to communication problems. If we can get the right people around the table at the right time and have the right kind of conversation, particularly if we've got all of the information we need on the table, most ethical problems seem to disappear. Secondly, it's important to remember that good ethics requires a cooperative arrangement. We're wanting people to achieve a level of mutual understanding, which requires clarity of communication and an openness to the views of others. It can be difficult to reach that mutual understanding, and we may need some help to do that, which is where a clinical ethics team can provide some assistance. We also need to look after our caregivers. Our caregivers are the front line in our connection with parents. They also have to apply sometimes difficult treatment plans, and sometimes those treatment plans aren't particularly well understood. And when situations resolve badly, as they sometimes do, our caregivers need support to work through their feelings, to work through their reaction, their involvement, so that they can come out in one piece with their dignity preserved and become better caregivers. The last point I'd like to make is that ethics should not be seen as a threat. A good ethicist doesn't make medical decisions. That's for the medical team. But a good ethicist can help us see through the complexity so that good decisions can be made. Ethics is about cultures, it's about communication, it's about relationship, and only then about problem solving. If we get the communication right, if we get the relationship, the culture right, good ethics is much easier to achieve.